everyone, this is CricketSong with Lunar Wisdom, and I'm here with another video for you. And in this video, I am going to be discussing the benefits of creating and maintaining a permanent sacred space or circle. So I want to begin by mentioning that I definitely understand that many of you, and even myself in my past, have not had the luxury of creating and maintaining a permanent sacred space. I know here in Seattle, the apartments are very small, and in many instances, individuals need to have a roommate in order to be able to afford the housing. And in those instances, they don't have the space to create a permanent sacred space. I recognize that. And I have been in a similar situation in my past. But what I would like to talk about and discuss with you is the benefits that a witch can encounter when they are able to have a permanent sacred space. I want to point out that it doesn't matter the size of the permanent sacred space. It could be just a little space that you stand, just the place you stand. That might be your permanent sacred space, or it could be a very large 9-foot circle, or the totality of an entire backyard, or a specific room in your home. The size really doesn't matter. It's the ritualistic way in which you interact with that space that I have found brings me the most benefits. So in creating the sacred space, we set aside this particular location for practicing our witchcraft or our magic. It's the space that we always, or almost always, go to in order to do the magics that we are intending to do. So in my past, in the apartment that I lived in when I first started practicing, it was just a section of the dining room. In the last home we lived in, it was, again, a section of the dining room, but it was a much larger section. It was actually the totality of the dining room. And in this home that we're renting here now, it's a section of the living area. That is my sacred space. If I look at the general practice, I could even say that my entire home is a sacred space. But that's more of a common sacred space, meaning that everybody in the home maintains that sacred space in the way that we interact with it and we maintain it. But for the conversation, I'm talking about a personal sacred space that I, the witch, go to practice my magic. Now, this does not mean that this is the only place I go to. Occasionally, I come out here in the backyard, or I'll go on a hike, or I'll go into even different locations here in Washington State to practice my magic. But for the majority of my practice, I go to my sacred space where I have my altar. But having an altar does not necessarily make that space a sacred space. Many times, the location where your altar may be tends to be in your sacred space, but it doesn't necessarily identify that that space is your sacred space. And what I mean by that is your sacred space may not include an altar, and the altar is not necessary for a sacred space. When I'm talking about sacred space, when I'm in this whole conversation, in my definition, the sacred space is a location that I have dedicated to the practice of my witchcraft, in however that practice looks. It's a place that I don't tend to do anything other than magic. Now, in my example here, where my sacred space is part of my living room in the home, that section of the living room is dedicated for my witchcraft practice, and nobody else in the family tends to do anything else in that section. It's my section, and it's where I practice my witchcraft. Now, my sacred space has an altar, and again, yours does not have to include an altar, but I have put specific things in that space to help me focus my energy on the intention at hand. The things that I have included in my sacred space are things that will help me associate my intention, my emotions, will help get me in the mood to practice my magic. It helps me shift my state of consciousness so that I am ready and prepared to practice my witchcraft. So the benefits in having a permanent sacred space, the first obvious benefit I would say is that in my sacred space are all the tools and items that I would need in order to practice my witchcraft. So my cauldron, my ritual blade, my herbs, the stones, oils, anything that I'd be using in my craft is kept in that sacred space. So lighters or matches and incense, everything is just within an arm's reach. So I don't have to disengage myself in order to go into another room to get something I might need in order to practice my witchcraft or to cast a spell or to do a working. Everything is kept in that sacred space. Everything, so I know where the things and the items are that I'd be using on a regular basis. I keep it within my sacred space. That's a first benefit and a most obvious benefit. The second benefit is that when I interact with that specific location, when I interact energetically, emotionally, magically with that location where my sacred space is, there is a buildup of power, a buildup of energy in that sacred space. My relationship, my personal energetic vibrational signature interacts with that sacred space over and over again. So I build a relationship with that space. It's almost as if the space becomes a partner, a magical partner. Because I continuously go to that space, my energy automatically merges with that energy because I've established a relationship. And the more that I nurture, the more that I go there, the more that I interact with it, I find for me, it's easier to tap into the power and siphon that for myself, for my use, as well as I gain energy from that. So it's not only a merging of our energies, but it becomes a relationship. It's just like having a relationship with an individual. The more I maintain and nurture that relationship, the stronger the bond is. That's the same with a sacred space. It's just like if I use a ritual blade, I begin to maintain an energetic relationship with that ritual blade, and my magic becomes easier, or that tool becomes more powerful within my practice. I find this is the same with my permanent sacred space because I continuously go to that location for that purpose. And then the last benefit that I can think of that I have encountered with the sacred space, having it permanent, is that it becomes a trigger for me. A trigger in a positive way. I know we talk about triggers, and usually it's a trigger to past trauma, and it's a very negative connotation we have with the word. For me, having a permanent sacred space is a trigger in a positive way. As soon as I step foot in that space, all the past experiences I've had with my magics and emotions that I associate and I have with my witchcraft, it comes back. It's triggering a response from me. And for me, that becomes a very magical thing. It aids my shifting into an altered state of consciousness quicker. It triggers that for me. And I find that I'm able to slip into my magical practice easier. My focus is sharper. My concentration is more focused. That is definitely, for me, one of the main benefits of having a sacred space. I may pass my sacred space when I'm walking into the living room of my home, and I can be triggered just by looking at it, just by thinking about it. There is a vibration that surrounds my sacred space, that is in my sacred space, that I am able to just tap into, even if I'm not in that sacred space. When I visualize my sacred space, it helps shift me into an altered state of consciousness, even if I'm not in that sacred space. I don't know if that makes sense. I hope it does. If you have questions about that, please ask. And I would love to hear what benefits you have if you have established and maintain a permanent sacred space. What benefits do you have in us doing that? And perhaps what negative associations or what negatives can you come up with for having a permanent sacred space, if any? Because I couldn't think of any. Because just because you have a permanent sacred space doesn't mean you always have to practice in that location. You can most certainly practice in other locations, but for me, a permanent sacred space is the place and location I go to the most when I practice magic. Can't wait to hear from you. And until next time, I love you. Mwah. Blessed be.